If you struggle with feeding yourself, like giving yourself permission to use like what I call shortcuts, but like convenience types of things that make it just easier to feed yourself. If it's like getting single serving cups of Greek yogurt versus a big container, because that means you'll actually use the Greek yogurt. Those kind of little things don't seem like a lot, or even giving you an idea of portions and how much is enough. Like getting things that are individually packaged sometimes is nice because it gives you like a natural stopping point, right? Like if you tend to clean your plate or eat the whole bag of chips until the chips are gone, it's like, okay, if I get a little individual size, I can go get more if I want them. There's more than, one bag of chips, but at least it makes me pause and check in with myself to see like, I've already had this little bag of potato chips. Do I really want more versus it being, the big family size and you're just sitting and eating it. It's a lot easier for half that bag or more to just kind of disappear. And you're like, where did all that go?
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Successful with ADHD. Today, I have dietitian and author Becca King, who's a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor from Charlotte, North Carolina. We are going to talk all things eating and ADHD and learn about Becca's journey on today's episode because she's an adult with ADHD who actually struggled for years with disordered eating. And she's passionate about helping other adults with ADHD who struggle with binge eating, chronic dieting, and body image issues find food freedom and improve their self-esteem. And Becca uses the principles of intuitive eating and a weight-inclusive approach to nutrition for ADHD in her virtual practice. So I'm sure if you're listening here today and you're on Instagram, you're likely following Becca at ADHD.nutritionist on Instagram. And I am thrilled that we're finally doing this. It's been a year in the making.
Yes. We did it.
Yay.
Thanks for having me, Brooke.
Absolutely. This is going to be a great one because I know you personally, professionally,
Yes.
and I can't wait to dig in a little bit more for everyone listening.
Yeah.
So, Becca, when did you learn you had ADHD?
I learned I had ADHD my sophomore year of college. So I kind of started to think I had it my freshman year, but didn't really do a whole lot about it. And then my sophomore year, I really struggled my freshman year and my sophomore year with school and pretty much everything. I decided to bring it up with my therapist because I was like, there's just everything feels like way harder than it is for everybody else than I know.
And the therapist suggested that you had it?
Yeah, she kind of started the diagnostic process with me, which was helpful. And then I was like, yes, you have the combined type of ADHD. And I was like, okay. And then looking back, it was like, all of those moments, you're like, okay, yeah, now I get why all these things were a challenge for me.
And what were you going to school for at the time?
To be a doctor, actually. I wanted to be an anesthesiologist. And I didn't do well enough in my own words my freshman year, but I did perfectly fine. So then I was like, I'll switch to business. And then I hated business. Not for me. And then I was like, I think I'll go to nursing school. So I went to nursing school and I loved my nutrition class. And then my GPA was like 0.04 something from getting into like the second half of nursing school. And so I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And you have basically, at the time, my program only had one time you could apply for the second half. So you had to pay for a whole year of tuition that went towards no minors or anything. They were like, the credits don't count, but you have to be a full-time student to apply again. So I was gosh. I'm not paying a year's worth of tuition that's not going to at least get me like a minor in Spanish or something,
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I really liked this nutrition class and a dietitian taught it. And then I was like, and I've seen a dietitian, when I was in high school for my eating disorder. I was like, I'm going to go have coffee with her and see like what it's like to be a dietitian. And I was like, I actually kind of like this better, I think, like in terms of the work-life balance and like nutrition is probably, I would say, a special interest of mine. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start going down that path. So I changed my degree to public health, and that's what I finally landed on, and then went and got my master's in nutrition afterwards. So definitely changed my major lots of times.
But it sounded like in each one of those, you always wanted to help people.
Yes.
And learn the science behind how you can help people.
Yes. Yeah. Like I knew whatever I did, I wanted to help people in some capacity. I just kind of found my way to nutrition. So, which is nice because I was like, oh, I don't really want to work 12-hour shifts or work, holidays or weekends. Like sometimes you do that as a dietitian, but you are pretty much like a 9 to 5 kind of hospital, usually if you're in the hospital setting type of dietitian. And I was like, that's not too bad, but being a nurse would be, is a lot more sacrifice there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the schedule sounded a lot better having your own business as a dietitian.
And that honestly wasn't really even on my radar until grad school. And I was like starting to listen to some podcasts and stuff about being a dietitian. And I was like, oh, private practice is a thing. This would be cool. And totally matches up with having ADHD. Like I'm pretty sure most of the dietitians I know that have their own practice are neurodivergent.
Yeah, I think I've seen most of them.
Yeah. It's so funny when someone will share, like, even if they're not in the like ADHD space, but they're in kind of my space, and they'll share something about having ADHD. And I'm like, that makes so much sense. Okay.
So how do you think your eating disorder at the time correlated or not to your undiagnosed ADHD?
Ooh. So my junior year of high school, my family moved from Atlanta or outside of Atlanta to Charlotte. And that I remember specifically being like, I can't control anything, but I can control what I eat. And becoming very like perfectionist, all or nothing, like I'm going to eat as healthy as possible. And that was just this pathway down to an eating disorder of like, okay, I have all of these super intense food rules. So I struggled with anorexia, and then kind of through my recovery process, kind of the pendulum swung the other way. And towards like grad school is more so like in a binge restrict cycle with things. But I think it was a lot of things feeling out of control. And it was something I felt like I had a little bit of control, and like my brain felt chaotic. And like that was something almost I could like hyper focus on, was like learning everything I could about nutrition and health and stuff like that in high school. And I did. Yeah, and it was just kind of a slippery slope, unfortunately, with taking it just a little too far with things. So,
you mean the binging and the restricting?
Yeah, and just the restriction in general. Like I was, especially like my junior, senior year of high school, everyone would be like, "Oh, Becca, you're such a healthy eater," all that kind of stuff. But like, I was very restrictive with what I ate, and had a ton of food rules, like, and was a miserable person to probably go out to eat with. I remember apologizing to my sister a few years ago. I was like, I'm sorry that you had to deal with me like going out to eat, because that was stressful for me, because it's like, oh my gosh, there's too many calories on the menu and all these things, and having to look up the menu and then not eating, like just having weird things about food. So it's just kind of, I'm glad that things kind of have shifted and changed over time, and now I don't binge and I'm not in that cycle anymore. But it was definitely, I think, gave me like something I could focus attention on and not deal with everything else that was in my brain.
Sure. So you were hyper focusing on that.
And I think the dopamine from it too, like it's something I was good at, and so that was like stimulating to my brain to be good at that, which is not a good thing. Definitely not healthy at all. But it was like, oh, I can put my attention towards this, and it worked out. Not so great, but like my brain thought it did at the time.
Yeah. So there's a lot of correlation between disordered eating and ADHD.
Yeah.
And you were one of the first ADHD dietitians that came out on social media.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, you mentioned the dopamine piece. Why do so many people with ADHD struggled with disordered eating?
Yeah. I think it's a multiple, almost like kind of like pillars that, kind of everything kind of feeds together in a way. I would say the dopamine piece is one. So binge eating and bulimia are like the two most common eating disorders. So kind of the difference between them is with bulimia, you usually are engaging in like compensatory behaviors to make up for binge eating, usually like purging, overexercising, laxatives, those kind of things. Whereas someone who's binge eating, they're just eating large amounts of food in small, short or periods of time, and not doing those things. But that there's some research to show that since our brains, at a very oversimplified way of explaining it, are lower in dopamine, and food is a very accessible, tasty, low effort way to get our brains that dopamine, but it's hard to regulate. And then usually I think of it as like, especially sugar, is like, it's the source of dopamine, but it's not like the most rewarding or long lasting. It's kind of like a quick or cheap dopamine that like, I just want more of. That kind of like social media is. If you're like, cool, I got, like, I'm getting dopamine from this, but I need more of it, versus like doing maybe some other things that might be a little more health promoting than maybe, eating candy or whatever for stimulation. But I'd say that executive dysfunction is another thing, like being able to plan and to follow through on the plan and to cook. And cooking itself just requires, every part of our executive functions is involved in feeding ourselves. So like, it makes sense that it would be challenging. And if you don't like cooking, it's really hard to motivate yourself to do it on a regular basis. So there can be that disconnect of like, I know I should be cooking more meals at home, or I should be, eating more vegetables and doing these things, but there's all these barriers that are getting in the way for me from being able to do that. So I think for ADHDers, we get exposed to diet culture too. So we get to deal with all that pressure of trying to be thin, or that we should be thin. We get to deal with all that. And I think there's just some unintentional restriction often that happens as a part of ADHD, of not having a plan or things on hand, or being impulsive of like, oh my gosh, I forgot that I need to eat breakfast and now I'm going to stop through the drive-thru. And that just kind of becomes, a pattern kind of thing.
So how would you define then disordered eating?
So technically it's like anything that's like any type of eating that's like not considered like the norm. So I think that binge restrict cycle would be a great example of like disordered eating that can be very unintentional for ADHDers. It's not like they're waking up like, I'm not going to eat until 5 or 6 o'clock at night, and then I'm going to eat my majority of my energy from 6 o'clock until I go to bed. Usually it's unintentional, like my meds suppress my appetite, or I'm just so busy I don't even think about food, or I think about it and whatever's available is not healthy enough or good enough, so I'm just not going to eat. Or there's too many, that transition's too complicated, of like, I'm working and I don't want to transition to go do, prepare myself food and then get back to work, so I'm just going to keep working, and I'll get to it in a second, and then 4 hours go by and you still haven't eaten yet. So
Yeah. So disordered eating, it sounds like, and I don't know if you have the stats, but the good majority of people with ADHD have disordered eating.
Yeah, I would argue probably. A lot of times disordered eating is like kind of that like step down from an eating disorder, where you don't quite fit like a specific eating disorder diagnosis, but you kind of have some traits of an eating disorder. But it's not something that like fits that criteria. But a lot of folks, especially that I work with, I would say definitely have disordered eating behaviors.
So if you're talking about like different levels, there's disordered eating and then eating disorder on top.
Yeah. Eating disorders would be like
more restrictive.
Yeah, more severe. So like binge eating would be something that you're probably doing multiple times a week or even in a day, depending on how bad it is. but there's probably a lot more guilt and shame with an eating disorder versus disordered eating, I would say.
So how would you treat someone with an eating disorder compared to disordered eating?
Yeah. It would depend on how severe their behaviors are. Depending on that severity, like someone might go to like an inpatient facility. Like if someone, especially like if someone needed to kind of be refed, if they were so restrictive that they're malnourished. Going inpatient means that they're going to be getting meals provided and they're going to see a therapist and someone, is going to be monitoring them basically all the time. Then there's like outpatient rehab that some people will do where they may not be quite severe enough to be admitted, but they'll kind of go during the day for a few hours, come home. And that way there's still some supervision, but there's still a little bit more freedom if you like needed to go work or do things you could. Someone who has disordered eating probably wouldn't go to an eating disorder facility or something like that. They might just work more with like a dietitian outside and not in like a facility type of place. And then usually like once you're a little bit more like stable is when you'll kind of start seeing somebody hopefully on the outside. And usually it's kind of a team when you have an eating disorder. You're seeing a doctor, you're seeing a therapist, you're seeing a dietitian, you might have group support in some kind of way. If there's anything else, like any special people that might need to be added to the treatment team too, they'll do that. So
I'm going to ask you a tough question. So if
yeah.
it's too tough, feel free not to answer. Would you say that you still have an eating disorder?
Ooh. I think like many people, I remember reading this when I was struggling with an eating disorder. I was reading some girl's blog and she was like, like you never really recover and like it doesn't ever fully go away. And I would say that that's true. It's just more so knowing like, yeah, I'm in recovery, but just like, like an alcoholic could relapse and start drinking again. Like I could engage in those behaviors again, but I'm not currently, which is amazing. And I'm really happy about that and done a lot of work to get there. But I think it's just knowing that like recovery is an ongoing journey.
Ongoing.
Yeah, that you're always having to work on because there's things that like pop up in life that are like a trigger that could be like, ooh, that's how I'm going to basically go like regulate myself is to binge. And so being like, okay, I'm dysregulated. What can I do that's actually going to serve me when I'm feeling dysregulated and help my nervous system versus like going and binge eating is going to make me not feel good in the moment. It might take care of like that dysregulation, but the feeling afterwards physically and mentally like isn't worth engaging in those in that behavior again. That's like, oh, that's an option and you kind of like see it blip by and you're like, but I need to go do something else, or reach out for support in some way or something like that.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, it's all essentially starting with awareness. And then if it continues to stay top of mind for you that this is something that used to be out of your control, but now you know how to control it in a different way.
Yeah.
You have other healthier options.
Yes. Yeah. Like I have the skills and like I have the tools now, whereas before, years ago, I didn't really have those tools. And like, I think not knowing, like, if I look back at my freshman, sophomore year, and I was like, it was really hard. Like, if someone would have told me emotional dysregulation was a thing back then, it would have made my life so much easier because like I just didn't understand how to even like emotions are this big, scary thing. And I think that because of that, I would turn to food also from that, like not just from stimulation, but being emotionally dysregulated, and food was easy and accessible and, did the trick. But it really wasn't doing the trick long term. You're like, actually, I need to learn how to regulate myself a little bit better.
So we have the emotional dysregulation, the infrequency of dopamine, the highs, the lows, the medication, binge eating because of the medication.
Yeah.
What else do you see as a trigger for ADHDers to struggle with disordered eating or an eating disorder?
Yeah, sensory sensitivities would be another big one. There's a eating disorder. It's called ARFID, so avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And there's starting to be a little bit more research on it, but I would suspect that the statistics are much higher. Like they always talk about ARFID as kind of this like kid teen eating disorder that you just like somehow magically grow out of, kind of like ADHD, where they're like, oh, all of a sudden you just don't have this thing anymore.
Boop, it's
Boop,
cured.
You grew up, you're fine. You're not like a quote unquote.
You chose not to have it anymore.
Yeah, like you chose to not be a picky eater anymore, quote unquote. And it's like, oh no, like sensory issues, that's one way they can kind of manifest, where like someone might look almost like they have anorexia, but they're not restricting because of fear of weight gain. They're restricting because like foods, the taste, the texture, maybe they had food related trauma in some kind of way. Or there's some people who are just like genuinely not interested in food in the way that other people are. And so it can be hard to kind of, again, motivate yourself if like, it's like food's just boring. And like, if, they're type of people who are like, if I could just like take a pill to like get my nutrition needs in for the day, I would.
That's my husband's.
Yeah. And I'm like, I would be over it. And I'm like, man, I just love food so much. Like I could never do that. Like I saw these, I used to get this ad for these like jelly things, and they were like, one little jelly thing was like a bunch of nutrition. And I was like, I don't even know how that's physically possible to pack that in this little thing. But I was like, but I also want to eat. Like, I like
enjoy
eating,
it.
and I enjoy it. Yeah. And I enjoy cooking when I have this, like the capacity to do it. It's something I enjoy, but that's not all the time. And that's also okay. So yeah, it's just interesting. Because there's some people.
Everyone's so different.
Yeah. So I think there will be more research into ARFID and how that connects with people that are neurodivergent, because I think there's a big overlap of people that I work with too, who are adults even, who are like, who really struggle, especially with like certain tastes and textures, and feel really stuck because they're like, all I hear about is I shouldn't be eating all these things, but these are literally the only foods that I like eating, that feels safe to me, and everything else. Like trying to eat fruit sometimes is just like, ugh, and I'm not going to do it. So trying to like work around some of those challenges too.
We were talking, my husband and I, about my stepson, and we believe that he has ARFID as well. Yeah. He had a traumatic experience with food where he choked when he was younger. And he has ADHD and other complexities.
Yeah.
But what he does with the food is he puts it in the front of his mouth and he moves it around, and he doesn't swallow it.
Yeah.
Right. So what we do with him is we give him safe foods like shakes, Ensure shakes. So he's getting protein, he's getting nutrients somehow, some way that feels safe to him. And my husband, like you mentioned, he would take a pill. He said he would inject himself if he could with the nutrients. But me on the other hand, and we have, our whole family has ADHD. And me on the other hand, I love eating, and I eat very fast, but I love eating.
I know. It's like, I'm like, man, it's over so quick.
I know. Make it go again.
Yeah, it's like, I remember like trying to eat slow is really hard for me.
No.
Like I am a fast eater, and I kind of have accepted that I am a faster eater. I still like trying to check in and like be a little bit mindful with my food, but I'll say even mindful eating can feel really inaccessible for ADHDers, or like eating without distractions. I have yet to have a client who's like, it is just so easy to sit down and just eat and like focus on the food. And, for most of my clients, like we're tweaking what mindful eating looks like. Like I think about it of like, okay, you probably need some extra sensory input. Like, what is that going to be? So you can actually eat and like not be like on your phone and watching TV and trying to eat, because you were at that point, like really probably very disconnected from your body. So it's a lot easier to overeat.
So funny. And then I want to dig into that a little bit more. I remember seeing a therapist growing up, and I don't know, she saw me eating somehow, some way. And she goes, can you like really be present to the eating process. And I'm like, no. And this is, again, before I knew I had ADHD. So I thought there was something wrong with me. I was like, well, I don't know why I eat so fast, but I just do. And I can't like make it an experience. I love eating, but it just happens.
Yeah, it's like I love eating the way that I eat. Like
Yeah,
not
exactly.
any other way. Yeah, it's just
Exactly.
yeah.
I love it. I love it. So, yeah, tell me about, you mentioned about the sensory input with eating. So,
Yeah.
how do you regulate that for someone with
Yeah.
ADHD?
So I think of it as like your Goldilocks spot kind of thing of like, what's the right amount of sensory input for you? And that will look a little different for everybody. Like for me, like listening to music or a podcast or a TV show like The Office or Parks and Rec that I've seen like a million times and I don't need to like, be engaged with the TV show versus like, oh, my new favorite show. I'm not eating a meal while I watch that because I won't
Mm-hmm.
even know when the food is gone. So like something like that for me, having something I can listen to so my eyes can still like be engaged with the food. For some of my clients, it is sometimes having a show on, or very few of my clients feel connected like with extra sensory input from like their phone or work while they're eating. So like I try to find other things that my clients can do. Sometimes even it's like, let me have a fidget in my hand. I have some clients who are like, I like to play like word games or something like that. Kind of like, when I always did this, like looked over
Mm-hmm.
the like back of the cereal box when I was a kid, even though like you would especially like see the
Mm-hmm.
same cereal box every morning, but I'm playing the games every single morning because I needed like something else to do. So sometimes it's just finding like that right thing that can make it like a little bit more enjoyable or give you something. Because like to me, when I eat in just dead silence, it's like nails on a chalkboard. Kind of like, let me hurry up. Like that eating fast happens really fast if there's nothing going
Get this
on.
done.
Yeah, like let me hurry up and do the next thing. So like adding music or something that will help me slow down a little bit. Sometimes even just sitting outside on my balcony, there's just like enough going on around in the city that I can like make it work. So,
Yeah, fair enough. What else do you recommend for people who are having a hard time eating, whether it be the executive function issue of planning and prep,
yeah.
or someone who has ARFID, or someone who just has sensory issues that doesn't necessarily have ARFID, but people who are struggling with food? What
Yeah.
would be that first step?
I would say giving yourself permission to like figure out what's going to work for you and what's going to help you feed yourself. So, like, eating enough and eating regularly to me are kind of like the foundation of things. And then we can start tweaking that nutrition piece. But so often people are like, oh, I need to eat healthier. I need to do this. I need to do that. And then I'm like, but we're only eating, if we're only eating twice a day, let's say, or, we're eating breakfast and then not eating until 6 o'clock at night. Like, we just need to get into the routine of eating, like kind of adopting that like fed is best mantra of like, okay, what can we eat? And like what can lower the barrier to eating. So for people with ARFID, like making sure you have seafoods on hand, making sure, even if you don't have ARFID, but if you struggle with feeding yourself, like giving yourself permission to use like what I call shortcuts, but like convenience types of things that make it just easier to feed yourself. If it's like getting single serving cups of Greek yogurt versus a big container, because that means you'll actually use the Greek yogurt. Those kind of little things don't seem like a lot, or even from like giving you an idea of portions and how much is enough. Like getting things that are individually packaged sometimes is nice because it gives you like a natural stopping point, right? Like if you tend to clean your plate or eat the whole
Mm-hmm.
bag of chips until the chips are gone, it's like, okay, if I get a little individual size, I can go get more chips if I want them. There's more than, one bag of chips, but at least it makes me pause and check in with myself to see like, I've already had this little bag of potato chips. Do I really want more versus it being, the big family size and you're just sitting and eating it. It's a lot easier for half that bag or more to just kind of disappear. And you're like, where did all that go? So I think like giving yourself permission to use some of those things, because people are like, oh, well, a lot of the like, oh, processed food is bad kind of thing. But like there's lots of processed foods that are very nutrient dense. So I think people like kind of forget that in that conversation around processed foods. It's like you can find more, some of them might be a little bit more expensive, but you can find things that are more processed that are still low in sodium and saturated fats and are higher in protein and fiber, because that's really when it comes to like people saying, oh, processed foods are bad. There's some extra additives in some ultra processed foods, but you can still find like what would be an ultra processed food that is like a protein bar or a protein shake. Even those Ensure drinks would be like an ultra processed food, but it means that, it means your stepson's getting the really important nutrients that he needs so he can grow. And that's what matters more than being like, oh, I can't have that. It's like, okay, well, if we're not eating anything, that's far worse than maybe eating something that like might be deemed a little bad because it's processed. But at the end of the day, again, it's still getting all the things that you need in for your body. And that's what's important.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're sharing that, because I know there's a lot of talk and a lot of
fear-mongering.
Yes, fear-mongering about bad foods and eating. And I know there's this line, it's like you've mentioned so many times, that eating, regardless of what it is still better than not eating.
Yeah. And like eating on a regular basis, like, and keeping your blood sugar more stable that way, like it makes such a difference. And I think we just end up getting on this like roller coaster. If we're eating inconsistently, our blood sugar is also on a roller coaster, and that doesn't make us feel good either.
So when you say eating consistently 3 to 4 hours?
Yep. About that. It doesn't have to be perfect. I have some clients like who are like, 2 hours is actually like my 2 to 3 is my sweet spot. And then I have some who are like, I can kind of push it a little bit longer. But like 5 to 6 is when your blood sugar will like start to drop. So if you notice, especially for a lot of folks, like even if you're medicated or unmedicated, you might not get a growling stomach. And that's just like one hunger cue. So like, I think it's important to remember that like you probably have hunger cues, you just don't connect them to hunger. And that, because it happens with a lot of my clients, like I don't really know what hunger feels like. And then we start like eating more regularly and I start asking them about their hunger cues, and they're like, oh yeah, I get a headache in the afternoon, or my mood changes and I get really hangry, or my energy dips, or even though I'm on my medication, I like really can't focus all of the sudden, and that it makes no sense. And then they're like, oh, then I realize I need to eat, and I eat, and then I imagine that I can go do what I need to, what I was trying to focus on. So I think noticing some of those patterns throughout the day of like, hey, does my energy tank at this time? Or, does my mood change? Like for me, when I'm on my meds, I get very irritated at like little things that normally wouldn't irritate me, like my internet being slow, and it's not slow. So it's like, that's usually just like a cue for me. Like, when did we last eat? Because if we're angry at this, or like some little thing, like if a noise is bothering me or those kind of things, I'm like, that normally wouldn't bother me. When was the last time we ate? And 99% of the time, it's time to eat. So
So hangry is a real thing.
It is. Yes, it is a real thing. It's harder to regulate our emotions when we're hungry. So if you notice that might be a sign that you're like, my whole family gets hangry. So when we're like on vacation together as a family, it's like, okay, if anyone starts to kind of slightly snap at each other, we're like, all right, we need to make plans to get food in the next like 20 minutes so that no one gets angry at each other.
I love that. Yeah. When I start, saying something to my husband and it's like 6:30 at night, he's like, uh-oh, I've lost you already. Yeah. You're hangry.
Yeah.
What about intermittent fasting? Because that kind of goes against what we're talking about.
If you have a history of an eating disorder, intermittent fasting is not recommended because it is a form of restriction. So I always like to mention that. Or if you notice like you're prone to it. There isn't a whole lot of research for ADHD into intermittent fasting yet. I haven't really seen anything on that. From a weight loss perspective, it's not really any different than other forms of calorie restriction. So it's kind of like whatever works best for you. And I'd say like I would rather, for me, I don't, since I'm an intuitive
Eat all
eating
day.
dietitian, I don't encourage restricted dieting. But if you find like, I don't know, to me, you're not fueling your brain regularly with carbs throughout the day. And to me, that's like just making it harder to function. And for most of my clients, which is definitely a bias, but like most of my clients struggle with binge eating or disordered eating. And like that evening chunk of the time is the most challenging time of the day. So if they're like fasting until 2 or 3 p.m., that's like already usually that witching hour. And then they're kind of in that binge cycle, throughout the evening. So it's like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'm intermittent fasting, quote unquote. But like, if you're like binge eating during that eating window, like it probably isn't helping as much as you thought it would. And for a lot of folks that I work with, if they haven't tried intermittent fasting, it like becomes kind of a game of like, oh, I have this many minutes before I can, I have to be done eating, or, those kind of things. And so if it works for you, great. But if it doesn't like allow you to live a fulfilling life or the life that you want to, like for me, I'm like, I could never do that because I like breakfast way too much. And I could never do like go sit at a brunch with my girlfriends and have like them all eat food and me just sit there and like, I'll just drink a black coffee and watch you guys enjoy your food. I would be miserable. So, but I think whatever is sustainable and works for you, if you have to like work, if it feels like you have to work 10 times harder just to feed yourself to do it, it's probably not like a sustainable eating pattern, because we want it to be easier to feed yourself. Like it shouldn't be this big, really hard, complicated process. And I think sometimes we, especially with like meal planning, like I have so many clients, like it needs to be this whole like elaborate, system that they're trying to set up. But it's like, well, that might look nice and pretty, just kind of like, getting a planner and like having some pretty organization system, right? Like I'll do that and then it'll solve all my problems. It's like,
all my problems.
yeah. And then it's like, and now I still don't follow through the meal plan. And then you feel terrible because like, I just spent hours setting up this system and it doesn't work. And it's like, can we make this system simpler? Like, cause it probably doesn't need to be super complicated. Yeah. Cause I think it would be lovely to make it, cool and technological and all of that. But it's like, sometimes it's like simple is what works. So
keep it super simple.
Yes.
So Becca, you have a book coming out soon. Can you tell us about it?
It's called How to Eat Well for Adults with ADHD. I'm really excited about it because it's going to be a non-diet book to food and nutrition for ADHDers. So kind of like a how-to guide to feed yourself, because I think it's just something that I saw that was missing from a lot of the books on diet. And ADHD was like, eat this, not that, or here's all these nutrients to be focusing on. And I'm like, that is awesome and amazing. But most of the clients that I work with, we're still like on the foundation of how do we feed ourselves? How do I know when I'm hungry? Things that maybe are a little bit farther back before we're like really tweaking what it is you're eating or adding more of these nutrients in. Because I've worked with someone like once who was eating one meal a day and was like, I want to optimize my nutrition. And I was like, well, first we just have to start eating more. Like, because like right now, like one meal a day, there's not much to optimize because you can't eat any more at that meal. We have to build some more into your day. So I think figuring out how to do that in a way that's doable and easier is kind of my goal. So
amazing. So what would be your one piece of advice that you would want to leave? And I know this is really hard for people with ADHD, just leaving one thing. So if it's more than one, that's okay. But in your expertise, personally and professionally in this field of ADHD and disordered eating, what is your one piece of advice for people?
I would say I might have two things. One thing I would say is that like things, and I would say you taught me this when I worked with you, is that like things are always going to be like what works one day might not work anymore. And that's really okay. Like meal planning, there's going to be things that are going to ebb and flow. And that doesn't mean that you've failed or you're, not doing good with nutrition or something like that. It's just like, okay, I just need to problem solve and figure out like what maybe I need to add some novelty in. Maybe I just need to change up the way that I'm doing things a little bit. And that's okay. Because I think sometimes people think, again, without like, once I get the one meal plan figured out, I'm never going to have to do it again. And it's like, yep, but then you're going to get to you're going to get a new job, or you're going to have a kid,
right?
Or you're going to,
your hyperfixation will end.
Yeah. You'll be, like it will change, and that's okay. And so it's like being okay with that, like ebb and flow of things, and like letting go of the shoulds, of like there is no one right way to feed ourselves. So like really letting go of that idea and figuring out, hey, what helps me nourish my body in a way that works for me, and being okay with that, and accepting that. Because I think we get a lot of pushback sometimes from people. They're like, well, you could just do this, or you could just do that. And it's like, but this is working, so I'm just going to rock and roll with it. So
I know my body. Thank you very much. So for the people who want more tips or want to work with you, Becca, where should they go?
You can find me on Instagram and Facebook and Threads at ADHD.nutritionist. I'm on TikTok, but I don't use it. So if you communicate with me there, I probably will never see it. And if you do want to work with me, the link in my bio has my discovery call link if you want to chat with me.
And your book will be available on Amazon?
Yes. So you can find it on Amazon, I think, Barnes & Nobles, and 2 other bookstores.
Amazing.
Yes.
I'm so glad we finally got to do this. Go out. If you're not already following Becca King, follow her at ADHD.nutritionist. Buy her book. You want to say it one more time for everyone listening?
How to Eat Well for Adults with ADHD.
Awesome. And do yourself a favor. Go eat.
Yes. That is best.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.